came to Egypt in November of 1992. The first day I saw him, my teacher, my master, he was standing in front of the Sphinx. And he was talking to us calmly and saying this and saying that. And then he just calmly talked and pointed over his shoulder. And he said, and she is the operative word, which we'll talk about as we discuss the Sphinx in detail. She is 54,000 years old. And all of us, our jaws dropped to the floor. And I looked at him and said, this is my man. I looked at the Sphinx. She said to me in my mind, this is the man you've been looking for all your life. This is your teacher. He is my son. And that started it, because I can tell you right now, we date the Sphinx at 54,000 years. The evidence is geological. To credit with somebody we're going to see, and again, we're going to mention other people who your listeners can follow up on. Of course, the great John Anthony West, who passed away last year at this time, great independent researcher, was the first one to challenge this because he was a champion of Schwaller de Lubitsch. So he wrote a book in 1979 called Serpents in the Sky, where he challenged the dating of the Sphinx and said it's much, much older due to the geology. And sure enough, here is the key. We have a mark. The type of erosion that's evident on the walls and body of the Sphinx are water-based, not wind and sand, as Egyptologists teach, because they want to date it at being 4,500 years old, 2,500 BCE, and it can possibly be any rainfall that it could, since then, that have caused the damage. But no, there is a geological marker that there is something, and again, people can Google this. People can follow up on this research, and which is what I love to share. It's called the Mousterian Pluvial. Pluvial. Pluvial in geology means a great rain event. Happened around 30,000 years ago. It all rained severe rainfall all of North Africa at that time. The type of erosion, and Schock points this out, we've got many other geologists come with us to point out, the type of erosion that's on the walls of the Sphinx cannot be caused by a flash rainstorm or flash flood. It has to be rain beating down at an angle for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The only time that could have happened was prior to 30,000 years ago. Because, the only time the Sphinx could have been built, because 30,000 years ago is the only event that could have caused a rainfall that causes that erosion. So we give a geological marker. The Sphinx has to be at least 30,000 years old. And Hakim would always say, she's 54,000 years old, prove me wrong. And if you want me to describe why we say she, I can do that. The Sphinx to the ancient people was the oldest of the old. She was the Alpha and the Omega. So here's the tradition that Hakim passed down. Again, a matriarchal society, matrilineal consciousness. The Sphinx represents an aspect that they called Nut, N-U-T. Again, people can Google it. They'll see it's a goddess of the sky. Well, Nut was the principle of creation and uncreation. In other words, Nut controlled what is created and what is uncreated. Now, the story comes down. When Nut wanted to manifest in physical form on the earth, she spit. And where she spit became the concept called Tefnut, T-E-F-N-U-T. Again, people can Google it. They will find out it's a goddess of moisture. Well, Tefnut meant the spittle of Nut. Why spittle? Well, I'll use the scientific term. Whenever we expectorate, it's never the same. There's no mass and there's no volume. So what Hakim is telling us is what the ancients are saying. You cannot define the Great Mother, because Nut is the Great Mother. You cannot define her. But if you must, we'll create a statue for her, and we'll call it Tefnut. And it's the spit of Nut, the spit of the Great Mother. To the ancient people, the Sphinx was always feminine, always female. Now, where the confusion comes today is, later, the Sphinx, the head of the Sphinx is totally out of proportion to the body. These were people who, if you study their architecture, you study their engineering, their geology, they were experts at harmony and proportion, always. So why is the head of the Sphinx so much smaller than the body? Well, it's been carved back several times, perhaps. But what we say, as she is today, the Sphinx is the face of a black African woman who is the mother of a man who was chosen to be the leader that became the unification, the so-called beginning of the Egyptian dynastic civilization, and he called the Sphinx, he carved the face of the Sphinx after his mother, who was a black African woman. There is a famous American orthodontist. His name is Sheldon Peck. People can Google that name too. He wrote a significant paper, opinion piece in the New York Times in the early 90s stating that the head and the face of the Sphinx today is that of a black African woman. And the scientific term, if you look at the Sphinx at a profile, the lower jaw juts out above the upper jaw. That's called, in a scientific medical term, bimaxillary prognathism. It means the lower jaw protrudes out above the upper jaw. It only exists in black Africans, not in Caucasians at all. The face of the Sphinx today is that of a black African woman, and I even could put a title on it. It was Nikhotep. She was a great ruler of the upper area of Egypt, and she's honored by her son by having the face carved in her. But again, the Sphinx was never male. Never met. So it's looked upon by the ancient people as a feminine symbol. And she is the oldest of the old. As far as we know, as far as archaeology on our planet goes, it's the oldest statue carved by humans on the planet. Someday probably we'll find something digging under the earth. And, the only thing we agree with Egyptology is, that we did with Zahi Hawass, he used to be the head of the Egyptian Department of Antiquities, that less than 18%, which is under the sand, has been uncovered in Egypt. So there's so many ancient temples. There's more pyramids under the sand, more things to be discovered. But as it stands in the world today, the Sphinx is the oldest sculpture carved by humans that we know of on the planet. And we dated it 54,000 years. And again, we challenge anybody to prove us wrong.